Kermit Gosnell in afterbirth abortions. Our story begins on February 18, 2010. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and detectives from the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office executed search warrants at the Women's Medical Society, a clinic operated by Dr. Kermit Gosnell at 3801-05 Lancaster Avenue in Philadelphia. The DEA, the Philadelphia Police Department, and the district's attorney's dangerous drug offender units had been investigating Gosnell and his clinic for months based on reports of illegal prescription drug activity. During the drug trafficking investigation, District Attorney's Detective James Wood learned from one of the clinic employees that a woman had died in November 2009 following an abortion procedure. Detective Wood discovered other disturbing details about Gosnell's medical practice. The premises were dirty and unsanitary. Gosnell routinely relied on unlicensed and untrained staff to treat patients, conduct medical tests, and administer medications without supervision. Even more alarmingly, Gosnell instructed unlicensed workers to sedate patients with dangerous drugs in his absence. Based on this information, Detective Wood believed that further investigation of the woman's death the previous November was warranted. The detective searched for a police report on the incident, but finding none, he went to the Philadelphia Medical Examiner's office to try to identify the woman and to find out more about her death. Detective Wood learned that the dead woman was Karnamaya Munger, and that her toxicology report revealed an extremely high level of Demerol, a drug Gosnell used at the clinic to anesthetize patients. This is not the start of a medical legal thriller novel. It is page 19 of the grand jury report handing down indictments against Kermit Gosnell, MD, and several members of his staff for multiple crimes, including 8 murders. And if you want to look up the references, they're there. That reference is also included in the email. The mainstream media have been rather quiet on this, but a Philadelphia physician is currently being tried on charges that his gross negligence led to the untimely death of a patient, and that he has personally murdered 7 babies, and probably hundreds more, but the records are unavailable to prove it. More from the grand jury report. In the light of this suspicious death and other significant health and medical concerns, DEA agent Stephen Doherty invited personnel from the Pennsylvania Department of State, which regulates doctors and the practice of medicine, and the Pennsylvania Department of Health, which regulates healthcare facilities, to accompany law enforcement officers. Remember, they're just investigating this prescription drug offense. So they're inviting these other people to come with them on the February 18 raid. No one from these agencies had visited the clinic in more than 15 years, even after the Department of Health had been informed of Mrs. Munger's death months earlier. The search team waited outside until Gosnell finally arrived at the clinic at about 8:30 p.m. He does his best work at night. When the team members entered the clinic, they were appalled, describing it to the grand jury as filthy, deplorable, disgusting, very unsanitary, very outdated, horrendous, and by far the worst that these experienced investigators had ever encountered. There was blood on the floor. A stench of urine filled the air. A flea-infested cat was wandering through the facility, and there were cat feces on the stairs. Semi-conscious women scheduled for abortions were moaning in the waiting room or the recovery room, by the way, wrapped from the waist down in towels only, or in blankets only, where they sat on dirty recliners covered with blood-stained blankets. All the women had been sedated by unlicensed staff long before Gosnell arrived at the clinic. Excuse me. And staff members could not accurately state what medications or dosages they had administered to the waiting patients. Many of the medications in inventory were past their expiration dates. Investigators found the clinic grossly unsuitable as a surgical facility. The two surgical procedure rooms were filthy and unsanitary. Agent Doherty described them as resembling, quote, a bad gas station restroom, end quote. Instruments were not sterile. Equipment was rusty and outdated. Oxygen equipment was covered with dust and had not been inspected. The same corroded suction tubing used for abortions was the only tubing available for oral airways. At this point, I pause and say, corroded? They're not using plastic tubing. Some kind of metal stuff they're using. Was the only tubing available for oral airways if assistance for breathing was needed. There was no functioning resuscitation or even monitoring equipment except for a single blood pressure cuff in the recovery room. Ambulances were summoned to pick up the waiting patients, but just as on the night Mrs. Munger died 3 months earlier, no one, not even Gosnell, knew where the keys were to open the emergency exit, which is padlocked shut. Emergency personnel had to use bolt cutters to remove the lock. They discovered they could not maneuver stretchers through the building's narrow hallways to reach the patients, just as emergency personnel had been obstructed from reaching Mrs. Munger, who had arrested at the clinic. The investigators found a row of jars containing just the severed feet of fetuses, almost like trophies. In the basement, they discovered medical waste piled high. The intact 19-week fetus delivered by Mrs. Munger 3 months earlier was in a freezer. In all, the remains of 45 fetuses were recovered at the clinic that evening and turned over to the Philadelphia Medical Examiner, who confirmed that at least 2 of them, and probably 3, had been viable. A simultaneous search of Gosnell's house found patient files that he had taken from the clinic. In a filing cabinet in his 12-year-old daughter's closet, they found $240,000 in cash and a gun. Now, if that doesn't upset the left, I don't know what will. A simultaneous search of Gosnell's house found patient files that he had taken from the clinic. In a filing cabinet in his 12-year-old daughter, on February 22, 2010, the Pennsylvania Board of Medicine suspended Gosnell's medical license, citing an immediate and clear danger to the public health and safety. On March 12, the State Department of Health filed papers to begin the process of shutting down the clinic. Now, at this point, I'm going to just kind of select various other places. We estimate that Gosnell took in as much as $10,000 to $15,000 a night, mostly in cash, for a few hours of work performing abortions. And this amount does not include the money he made as one of the top OxyContin prescribers in the state. The Women's Medical Society stands as a monument to an absolute disdain for the health and safety of women, and in many cases, of babies who are born alive in this filthy clinic. None of Gosnell's employees were licensed or properly trained. That's not 50%, that's 100% were not. Gosnell's staff warned him that 2 of his employees, Linda Williams and Sherry West, were not only unlicensed and unqualified, but sloppy and unconcerned as well. They presented an obvious danger to the clinic's patients, whom they routinely over-medicated and failed to monitor. When 2 of Gosnell's staff members sought abortions, they knew better than to go to him. They went to other clinics where they marveled that physicians actually counseled patients, but the facilities appeared sanitary and a doctor was in the room when they were medicated. Mrs. Munger was just one of many patients victimized by Gosnell's depravity. There were scores more. By the way, this is all right in the grand jury report. At least one other mother died following an abortion in which Gosnell punctured her uterus and then sent her home. He left an arm and a leg of a partially aborted fetus in the womb of another woman, and then told her he did not need to see her when she became sick days later, having developed a temperature of 106 degrees. He perforated bowels, cervixes, and uteruses. He left women sterile. He also killed live, viable, moving, breathing, crying babies. He killed them by cutting their spinal cords after their mothers had delivered them, after receiving excessive amounts of medication designed to induce active labor. This report documents multiple murders of viable babies. The evidence makes a compelling case that many others were also murdered. That leaves the government employees whose job was to make sure that things like this don't happen. Worth special mention is Janice Staloski of the Pennsylvania Department of Health, who personally participated in the 1992 site visit. There was one way back then, but decided to let Gosnell slide on the violations that were already evident then, with the promise that he'd fix them up. She eventually rose to become director of the division that was supposed to regulate abortion providers, but never looked at Gosnell despite specific complaints from lawyers, a doctor, and a medical examiner. After she was nonetheless promoted, her successor as division director, Cynthia Boyne, failed to order an investigation of the clinic even when Karnamaya Monger died there. Senior legal counsel Kenneth Brody insisted that the department had no legal obligation to monitor abortion clinics, even though it exercised such a duty until the Ridge administration. Tom Ridge was a Republican pro-life who succeeded Casey, who was as governor, who was a Democrat, Tom Ridge was pro-choice Republican, and Casey was a pro-life Democrat, interestingly enough. Following Casey was Rendell, who was also pro-choice. The current governor is pro-life. And I'm tempted to say thank God. And the department exercised that right to monitor abortion clinics again as soon as Gosnell became big news. In other words, yes, they did have that authority. They just didn't want to use it. The agency's head lawyer, Chief Counsel Christine Dutton, defended the department's indifference. People die, she said. Lawyers at the Pennsylvania Department of State behaved in the same fashion. Attorneys Mark Greenwald, Charles Hartwell, David Grubb, Andrew Kramer, William Newport, Juan Ruiz, and Kerry Maloney were confronted with a growing pile of disquieting facts about Gosnell, including a detailed inside account from a former employee, a 22-year-old dead woman. Every time, though, they managed to dismiss the evidence as immaterial. Every time, that is, until the facts hit the fan. And the grand jury comments, "We want better from our public servants. We trust that their actions will be reviewed and they will be held accountable." And you might be interested to know that, at least according to one source, several of these people have since resigned or been terminated. Well, not that way. And this is their kind of recommendation as to what to do. If oversight agencies expect to prevent future Dr. Gosnells, they must find the fortitude to enact and enforce the necessary regulations. Rules, now, it's enforce the necessary regulations. The rules must be more than words on paper. You've got to actually do it. We recommend that the Pennsylvania Department of Health plug the hole it has created for abortion clinics. They should be explicitly regulated as ambulatory surgical facilities so that they are inspected annually and held to much the same standards as all other outpatient procedure centers. Inspectors should review patient files, including ultrasound images on site. Equipment and employees' licenses should be scrutinized. Second trimester abortions should be performed or supervised by physicians board certified in obstetrics and gynecology, which Gosnell wasn't, by the way. The Pennsylvania Department of State must repair its review process. Complaints should be taken by internet and telephone, and patients should be assured of confidentiality and a response when the investigation is completed. No complaint should be dismissed until the subject's full history of prior complaints has been considered and malpractice databases have been examined. Reports about individual doctors should be cross-checked against reports about the medical offices where they have worked, and vice versa. In other words, you actually investigate. The Philadelphia Department of Public Health should do at least as much to control infectious medical waste as it does to inspect swimming pools and beauty parlors. Statutory changes are necessary as well. Infanticide and third trimester abortion are serious crimes. The 2-year statute of limitations currently applicable for these offenses is inadequate to their severity. The limitation period for late abortion should be extended to 5 years. Infanticide, like homicide, should have none. Impersonating a physician is also a serious and potentially very dangerous act, yet under current law it is not a crime at all. An appropriate criminal provision should be enacted. There may also be other statutory and regulatory revisions that we as lay people have not thought to consider. Legislative hearings may be appropriate to further examine these issues. And they have, as we will see. We recognize that these relatively technical recommendations will be unsatisfying to those fighting the abortion battle. Pro-choice advocates will argue that the real solution is government-funded abortion. Pro-lifers will see the case as an indictment of all legalized abortion. We must leave these broader questions to others. Our authority as a grand jury is more limited, but we exercise its full extent by recommending the maximum response available under criminal laws, murder charges. If you willfully disregard a deadly risk to the mother's life and kill her, you will be charged with murder. If you deliver a viable baby born alive and kill it, you will be charged with murder. That prospect may make doctors more careful about performing abortions, especially abortions approaching the legal limit. We hope so. Now, that's their recommendations. I'm going to just give you a little more of a taste of what's going on at the clinic, and then we'll switch to what's happened since then. When Latasha Lewis began work at the clinic in 2000, the practice would perform approximately 20 first trimester and 5 or 6 second trimester abortions every procedure night. By 2009, however, the practice's first trimester abortions had dropped off significantly. Lewis explained that Gosnell had a bad reputation in the Philadelphia community, and local referral agencies would not recommend his clinic to women seeking abortions. This assertion was confirmed by representatives of Philadelphia community organizations that provide referrals and information on sexual health services. As a result, Gosnell began to rely much more on referrals from other areas where abortions as late as 24 weeks are unavailable. More and more of his patients came from out of state and were late second trimester patients. Many of them were well beyond 24 weeks. Gosnell was known as a doctor who would perform abortions at any stage without regard to legal limits. His patients came from several states, including Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina, as well as from Pennsylvania cities outside the Philadelphia area, such as Allenton. He also had many late-term Philadelphia patients because most other local clinics would not perform procedures past 20 weeks. Gosnell staffed his abortion clinic with unlicensed and unqualified workers. Gosnell deliberately hired unqualified staff because he could pay them low wages, often in cash. Most of Gosnell's employees who worked with his patients had little or no remotely relevant training or education, nor did they have any certifications or licenses to treat patients. Yet they did so regularly and without supervision, in violation of Pennsylvania's medical practice standards and the law. And I think there's another reason he hired them, and that's because he could tell them whatever he wanted to, and they'd believe him, whereas trained people would know better. Tina Baldwin testified that certification did not matter to Gosnell. He told his workers that there was a grandfather clause where if you, since he's a doctor and he taught you, you could be automatically whatever it is he taught you to be. You could be certified because he taught you to do that. Kermit Gosnell himself was not qualified. Under Pennsylvania law, an abortion facility must have at least one doctor certified by the American Board of Obstetrics and Gynecology, either on staff or as a consultant. Gosnell, the only licensed physician associated with the Women's Medical Society, is not an obstetrician or gynecologist, much less a board-certified one. In fact, 40 years ago, he started but failed to complete a residency in obstetrics and gynecology. Gosnell presented 2 of his unlicensed workers as doctors in his practice and allowed them to treat, diagnose, and prescribe medicine for patients. Gosnell hired unlicensed medical school graduates Steve Messoff and Eileen O'Neill to practice as doctors at his clinic. They were presented to patients and staff as Dr. Steve and Dr. O'Neill, and Messoff was listed on a sign inside the office door as Dr. Steve Messoff, medical intern. Both saw, diagnosed, and treated patients when Gosnell was not at the clinic. And both prescribed medicines for patients who never saw Gosnell, even though their prescriptions bore Gosnell's signature. Messoff admitted writing on pre-signed prescription pads. O'Neill insisted that Gosnell signed the prescriptions after she wrote them. O'Neill is the only one who has not pled guilty in this whole bunch, except for Gosnell himself, who is now on trial. Cross said that she saw Gosnell insert into a woman's vagina a speculum that was still bloody from a previous patient. She testified about how Gosnell would ignore her complaints about his unsanitary practices. Quote, "The instruments were dirty. It was plenty of times that I had complained. It would be a speculum and he'd use it. I would complain. I'll leave the speculum on his tray so he can see it, so he can say something to whoever it is cleaning them. It'll have blood on it." And he would still use it. And it was a lot of girls that was complaining about getting infections, trichomonas, that's trichomonas actually, chlamydia, because of the instruments not being cleaned. Gosnell's practice of having unqualified personnel administer anesthesia began years before the death of Mrs. Mongar. We heard from a former employee, Marcella Stanley Chung, who told us that her training for anesthesia consisted of a 15-minute description by Gosnell and reading a chart he had posted in a cabinet. She was so uncomfortable medicating patients, she said, that she didn't sleep at night. She knew that if she made even a small error, I can kill this lady, and I'm not jail material. One night in 2002, when she found herself alone with 15 patients, she refused Gosnell's directives to medicate them. She made an excuse, went to her car, and drove away, never to return. Chung immediately filed a complaint with the Department of State, but the department never acted on it. She later told Sherilyn Gillespie, a Department of State investigator who participated in the February raid, that she has worked at 7 different abortion clinics and she has never experienced an illegally run, unsanitary, and unethical facility such as the Women's Medical Society operated by Dr. Gosnell. She has never reported to any other provider or facility to state authorities. In other words, she's not a complainer. And she's not even an anti-abortion activist. Gosnell knew that using unlicensed and uncertified staff was wrong. He had testified in the criminal trial of a man charged with illegally practicing medicine by assisting Gosnell with abortion procedures in 1972. In 1996, he was censured and fined in 2 states, Pennsylvania and New York, for employing unlicensed personnel in violation of laws regulating the practice of medicine. As far back as 1989, and again in 1993, the Pennsylvania Department of Health cited him for not having any nurses in the recovery room. Gosnell ignored the warnings and the law. He just paid his fines and knowingly continued the dangerous practice of employing unqualified personnel to administer dangerous drugs. It was his modus operandi. Even when Gosnell was in the clinic, he did not give written or oral orders for medication. Rather, the unlicensed workers determined the mix of drugs they would administer by referring to, although not always following, a chart that was posted in the recovery room. That chart, a cheat sheet of the clinic's sedation cocktails, was handwritten by a high school student, about 15 years old at the time, as far as I can tell, Ashley Baldwin, who worked every night except Sunday at the clinic, performing a variety of medical procedures for which she had no training. Ashley's color-coded chart described the various levels of sedation that Gosnell provided and the mix of drugs that comprised them as follows. Local, which is 10 milligrams of nalbuphine, physicians may know it better as Nubane, and 12.5 milligrams of promethazine. Or you could get heavy, which is 50 milligrams of Demerol and 12.5 milligrams of promethazine and 5 milligrams of diazepam. Or you can go Twilight, which is 75 milligrams of Demerol, 12.5 milligrams of promethazine, and 7.5 milligrams of diazepam. And finally, you can get Custom, which is 75 milligrams of Demerol. This is all IV. 12.5 milligrams of promethazine, and 10 milligrams of diazepam. In anesthesia for surgery form, which they have in Appendix B, presented to patients for their signature and payment, did not identify or describe the drugs to be administered. However, it suggested it will probably be best to pay the extra money, he's charging extra for the anesthesia, and be more comfortable if some of the following conditions are true for you. 1, the decision to have the procedure is a difficult decision. 2, medication is usually necessary for your menstrual cramps. 3, your decision has been forced by your parents or partner. 4, your family members or friends don't like pain. The comment of the grand jury was, we were particularly appalled by the reference in the form to a decision being forced on a patient by a partner or parents. A legitimate practitioner would never perform forced abortions. Gosnell would and did. As long as he was paid, the patient's wishes or circumstances were not his concern. And what about if this is just a question and answer? Are you getting to the actual testimony in front of the grand jury? What about if the patient was 20 or 20 to 24 weeks? And the answer is at 20 to 24 weeks, Dr. Gosnell will do dilatation for 2 days. For 23 to 24, he'll do dilatation for 2 days and he'll go in. We'll give them the medication to put them to sleep. At that time, we give them Custom. That's the highest level. What's that? More medication. It's higher than Twilight because all day we give them Twilight to put them to sleep and make them comfortable. So all day you're putting people to sleep? Yes. And they're waking up sometimes? Yes. And then you're putting them back to sleep? Yes. How many times would a patient wake up and go back to sleep? About 3 or 4 times. Before they're going in for their procedure? Yes. So if a patient is between 20 and 24 weeks, she would get even more additional medication? Yes. So she would already been awake and asleep 3 or 4 times throughout the day? Yes. Because she was given drugs throughout the day? Yes. By either yourself or Ashley or Sherry or Linda? Yes. And then when he, I think it is, arrives on site on the premises and he's getting ready to take care of it, to terminate the pregnancy, he would put the patients to sleep again? Yes. With a heavier dose of medication? Yes. Who would give that heavier dose of medication? Me, Sherry. Sherry would be in recovery at that time. Me, Linda, or Ashley. And would he tell you at that point how much to give, or would you just give what you knew to give? Now he's right there. Just give what I knew to give. How did you really know what to give? Just from looking at the sign? Okay, was he present when you did that medication? No, and sometimes he asked him, but it was a race thing. Now this is, I think, a black lady, as near as I can tell, that's testifying. And Gosnell himself, of course, is black. What do you mean? It was like sometimes he used to, okay, like if a girl, the black population African population was big here. So he didn't mind you medicating your African American girls, your Indian girl. But if you had a white girl from the suburbs, oh, you better not medicate her. Better wait until he goes in and talk to her, until he go in and talk to her first. And one day I said something to him and he was like, that's the way of the world. Huh? And he brushed it off and that was it. Gosnell's former employees testified that they knew many abortions were performed beyond 24 weeks because they had performed ultrasounds that established gestational ages greater than the 24-week legal limit. When this happened, they would tell Gosnell, and he would often redo the ultrasound, or staff members would be ordered to do so, to produce a different gestational age to record in the patient's file. Gosnell taught his employees how to manipulate the ultrasound machine to get a false reading, one that would make the fetus appear to be smaller and younger than it actually was. Latasha Lewis testified. Question, did anybody ever show you how to manipulate an ultrasound? Yes, who did? Dr. Gosnell. When did he do that? I'm not accurate with the dates, but I would say since I've been there, maybe the second time I came back, 03, 04 maybe. How were you instructed to manipulate the ultrasound, and for what purpose? Basically, to manipulate an ultrasound, if the woman was lying flat, if you just want an accurate ultrasound, you just place it on the patient's stomach and you would measure. If you want to adjust the measurements, you would just lift off the ultrasound a little bit, which you would make the head look a little smaller. So you would want to measure it, the measurements would be smaller. Based on, this is another area, and actually the first part of the paragraph I don't care that much, but Dr. Hillman opined that Nancy's baby was viable. The neonatologist told us that the survival rate for babies born at 29 weeks is 95%. At 30 weeks, the survival rate is nearly 100% at a good facility. Just keep that in mind when you're hearing how old these babies are. We learned of another illegal third trimester abortion only because the mother changed her mind. In 2004, a 27-year-old woman went to Gosnell pregnant with her first child. She testified that she was surprised when Gosnell told her she was 21 weeks pregnant. On the first day of what was to be a 2-day procedure, Gosnell inserted dilators into the woman's cervix. After Gosnell had finished inserting the laminaria, the woman asked him what happened to babies after they were aborted. She testified that Gosnell told her they were burned. At home, thinking over how Gosnell disposed of the fetuses, the woman had a change of heart. She called her cousin, and the cousin called Gosnell to tell him that they wanted him to take the laminaria out. Gosnell said that he could not do that once the procedure was started, and he did not want to return the $1,300 that the patient had already paid. The pregnant woman ended up going to the hospital at the University of Pennsylvania to have the laminaria removed. It was determined at the hospital that she was 29 weeks pregnant. A few days later, the 27-year-old delivered a premature baby girl. She was treated at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and today is a healthy kindergartner. Now, concerning Gosnell's salary, if you remember from how much he was getting, this amounts to nearly $1.8 million a year, almost all of it in cash, assuming just 3 procedure nights a week. Testimony indicated that he performed abortions from about 8 p.m. to 1 a.m., 3 nights a week for a total of 15 hours. In light of the testimony we heard that Gosnell performed the really late third trimester abortions on Sundays, his take was likely much higher, as he's doing probably over $2 million a year. Cash, wonder if he paid income tax on it. And none of this includes his income from writing prescriptions. According to one law enforcement agent, Gosnell was once one of the top 3 OxyContin prescribers in the state of Pennsylvania. Surgical abortions in Pennsylvania performed up to 24 weeks of gestational age are legal. Killing living babies outside the womb is not. That's the referral to afterbirth abortion. The neonatologist who testified before the grand jury defined born alive. According to this expert witness, the Federal Born Alive Infants Protection Act defines a human as somebody who's been completely expelled from the mother and has either a heartbeat, pulsating cord, or is moving. Pennsylvania's Abortion Control Act defines born alive similarly, but adds breathing and brainwave activity as indicators of life. Gosnell's staff testified about scores of gruesome killings of such born alive infants carried out mainly by Gosnell, but also by employees Steve Messoff, Linda Williams, and Adrienne Moten. These killings became so routine that no one could put an exact number on them. They were considered, quote, standard procedure, end quote. Yet some of the slaughtered were so fully formed, so much like babies, that should be dressed and taken home, that even clinic employees who were accustomed to the practice were shocked. One such baby was a boy born in July 2008 to a 17-year-old we will call Sue. Sue first met Gosnell at the Atlantic Women's Medical Services, an abortion clinic in Wilmington, Delaware, where Gosnell worked 1 day a week. The girl was accompanied by her great aunt, who had agreed to pay for the procedure and who testified before the grand jury. After an ultrasound was performed on Sue, Gosnell told the aunt that the girl's pregnancy was further along than she had originally told him, and that therefore the procedure would cost more than $1,500 that had been agreed on. It would now cost $2,500. Gosnell normally charged $1,625 for 23 to 24-week abortions. In other words, so he's going over his usual even. The aunt paid Gosnell in cash at the Delaware clinic. He inserted laminaria, gave Sue pills to begin labor, and instructed her to be at the Women's Medical Center in Philadelphia at 9 the next morning. Sue arrived with her aunt at 9 a.m. and did not leave the clinic until almost 11 o'clock that night. An ultrasound conducted by Karima Cross recorded a gestational age of 29.4 weeks. Cross testified that the girl appeared to be 7 or 8 months pregnant. Cross said that during 13 plus hours, this girl was given a large amount of Cytotec to induce labor and delivery. Sue complained of pain and was heavily sedated. According to Cross, the girl was left to labor for hours and hours. Eventually, she gave birth to a large baby boy. Cross estimated that the baby was 18 to 19 inches long. She said that he was nearly the size of her own 6-pound, 6-ounce newborn daughter. After the baby was expelled, Cross noticed that he was breathing, though not for long. After about 10 to 20 seconds, while the mother was asleep, quote, "The doctor just slit the neck," end quote, said Cross. Gosnell put the boy's body in a shoebox. Cross described the body as so big that his feet and arms hung out over the sides of the container. Cross said that she saw the baby move after his neck was cut, and after the doctor placed it in the shoebox, Gosnell told her, "It's the baby's reflexes. It's not really moving." Who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes? The neonatologist testified that what Gosnell told his people was absolutely false. If a baby moves, it is alive. Equally troubling, it feels a tremendous amount of pain when its spinal cord is severed. So in fact, the fact that baby boy A continued to move after his spinal cord was cut with scissors means that he did not die instantly. Maybe the cord was not completely severed. In any case, his few moments of life were spent in excruciating pain. Cross was not the only one startled by the size and maturity of baby boy A. Adrian Moten and Ashley Baldwin, along with Cross, took photographs because they knew this was a baby that could and should have lived. Cross explained, "Why did you all take a photograph of this baby?" "Because it was big and it was wrong and we knew it. We knew something was wrong." I'm not sure who took the picture first, but when we seen this baby, it was a shock to us because I never seen a baby that big that he had done. So I knew something was wrong because everything, like you can see everything, the hair, the eyes, everything. And I never seen, for any other procedure that he did, I never seen anything like that. The neonatologist viewed a photograph of baby boy A. Based on the baby's size, hairline, muscle mass, subcutaneous tissue, well-developed scrotum, and many other characteristics, the doctor opined that the boy was at least 32 weeks, if not more, in gestational age. Gosnell simply noted that the boy's size by joking, as he often did after delivering a large baby. According to Cross, the doctor said, "This baby is big enough to walk around with me or to walk me to the bus stop." The doctor released Sue to go home 13 or 14 hours after she arrived. Her aunt described her condition. She was moaning, she was standing up, she was like holding her stomach doubled over. She remained in pain for days and could barely eat. When she developed a fever, her aunt called Gosnell. He instructed the aunt to take her temperature and asked if she was taking pain medicine he had given her, which she was. But he did not have her come in to be checked out, and he did not suggest that she go to a hospital. When Sue started throwing up a few days later, her grandmother contacted a different doctor who told her to get to a hospital right away. Sue was admitted to Crozier-Chester Hospital. Doctors there found that she had a severe infection and blood clots that had traveled to her lungs. According to Karima Cross, who spoke to the aunt, Sue almost died. The teen stayed at the hospital for a week and a half. She became extremely thin and took months to recover, according to her aunt. Now, moving on from Gosnell to the people who were supposed to regulate him and why they didn't. Stolowski blamed the decision to abandon supposedly annual inspections of abortion clinics on DOH lawyers, who, she said, changed their legal opinions and advice to suit the policy preferences of different governors. Under Governor Robert Casey, she said, the department inspected abortion facilities annually. Yet when Governor Tom Ridge came in, the attorneys interpreted the same regulations that had permitted annual inspections for years to no longer authorize those inspections. Then only complaint-driven inspections supposedly were authorized. Stolowski said the Department of Health's policy during Governor Ridge's administration was motivated by a desire not to be, quote, putting up a barrier to women, end quote, seeking abortions. Brody confirmed some of what Stolowski told the grand jury. He described a meeting of high-level government officials in 1999 at which a decision was made not to accept recommendations to reinstitute regular inspections of abortion clinics. The reasoning, as Brody recalled, was, quote, there was a concern that if they did routine inspections, that they may find a lot of these facilities didn't meet the standards for getting patients out by stretcher or wheelchair in an emergency. And then there would be less abortion facilities, less access to women having an abortion. Apparently this is considered possibly a major problem with those abortion facilities. They're not prepared for emergencies. Now, I will have to tell you, I deliberately didn't give you some of the worst of it. There are photographs in the grand jury report that would turn your stomach. If you want to, go ahead and look at them. I put the website address up earlier. But if you do, I recommend that you don't eat before you look at it. It is not a pretty sight. The media. Terry Moran tweeted, Kermit Gosnell is probably the most successful serial killer in the history of the world. This ought to be a story. And yet, and again, there's the reference, is J.D. Mullane, who attended the trial and said, here are reserved media seats in courtroom 304 Thursday in Philadelphia where Gosnell is on trial. Empty all morning. Nobody was coming to the trial. No reporters. Little easier to see it there. There's a guy in the back who's not a member of the media. And finally, Kirsten Powers, who is a left-leaning person. On reading from the internet, it's difficult to tell for sure whether she is pro-life or pro-choice. It's pretty much undisputed that she used to be pro-choice. There's some hint that she may have drifted out of that. And she entitles this Philadelphia Abortion Clinic Horror, We've Forgotten What Belongs in page 1. Infant beheadings, severed baby feet in jars, a child screaming after it was delivered alive during an abortion procedure. Haven't heard about these sickening accusations? It's not your fault. Since the murder trial of Pennsylvania abortion Dr. Kermit Gosnell began March 18, there have been precious little coverage of the case that should be on every news show and front page. The revolting revelations of Gosnell's former staff who have been testifying to what they witnessed and did during late-term abortions should shock anyone with a heart. NBC 10 Philadelphia reported that Stephen Messoff, a former Gosnell worker, quote, described how he snipped the spinal cords of babies, calling it literally a beheading. It is separating the brain from the body. One former worker, Adrian Moten, testified that Gosnell taught her his snipping technique to use on infants born alive. Massoff, like other witnesses, has himself pleaded guilty to serious crimes, testifying, quote, "It would rain fetuses and blood all over the place." Here's the headline that the Associated Press put out in a story about his testimony that he saw 100 babies born and then snipped. This isn't the total number of babies snipped. This is just the ones that he saw. Staffer describes chaos at Pennsylvania abortion clinic. Chaos? Try massive murder? Chaos isn't really the story here. Butchering babies that were already born and were older than the state's 24-week limit for abortions is the story. There's a reason the late Democratic Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan called this procedure infanticide. Planned Parenthood recently claimed the possibility of infants surviving late-term abortions was, quote, highly unusual, end quote. Gosnell case suggests otherwise. Regardless of such quibbles about whether Gosnell was killing the infants 1 second after they left the womb instead of partially inside or completely inside the womb, as in a routine late-term abortion, is merely a matter of geography. That one is murder and the other is a legal procedure is morally irreconcilable. A LexisNexis search showed none of the news shows on the 3 major national television networks has mentioned the Gosnell trial in the last 3 months. The exception is when the Wall Street Journal columnist Peggy Noonan hijacked a segment on Meet the Press meant to foment outrage over an anti-abortion rights law in some backward red state and introduced inconvenient facts. The Washington Post has not published original reporting on this during the trial, and the New York Times saw fit to run one original story on A17, buried in the middle of the paper, on the trial's first day. They've been silent ever since, despite headline-worthy testimony. Let me state the obvious. This should be front-page news. When Rush Limbaugh attacked Sandra Fluke, there was nonstop media hysteria. The venerable NBC Nightly News, Brian Williams, intoned a firestorm of outrage from women after a cruel tirade from Rush Limbaugh, as he teased a segment on the brouhaha. Yet accusations of babies having their heads severed, a major human rights story if there ever was one, doesn't make the cut. You don't have to oppose abortion rights to find late-term abortion abhorrent or to find the Gosnell trial eminently newsworthy. This is not about being pro-choice or pro-life. It's about basic human rights. The deafening silence of too much of the media, once a force for justice in America, is a disgrace. And some more comments. This is the Gosnell case. HuffPost host says the left made a decision not to cover the trial. Since last week, a consensus has emerged. The national media has in large part ignored the trial of 72-year-old abortion provider Kermit Gosnell. Much less agreement, however, hovers over the question of why. Cameras aren't allowed in the Gosnell courtroom, goes one theory. The details of the proceedings are too grisly for family-oriented media outlets, goes another prominent theory. Lefty media bias goes yet another. In a HuffPost Live segment today on the issue, host Mark Lamont Hill made clear where his theoretical thinking lay. For what it's worth, I do think that those of us on the left have made a decision not to cover this trial because we worry that it will compromise abortion rights. Whether you agree with abortion or not, I do think there is a direct connection between the media's failed to cover this and our own political commitments on the left. I think that's a bad idea. I think it's dangerous, but I think that's the way it is. Strong words from a host on a left-leaning outfit. This is Washington Post. Martin Barron, executive editor of the Post, tells the Eric Wemple blog, "We believe the story is deserving of coverage by our own staff, and we intend to send a reporter for the resumption of the trial next week. In retrospect, we should have sent a reporter sooner." Here's some more comments. This is by Megan McArdle, and I'm starting down in the middle of it. The evangelicals in my Twitter and Facebook feed are asking, justifiably, why these crimes seem to be nowhere in the media. You'd think a lurid crime touching an issue of major national importance would be covered everywhere, and yet there's been very little. Molly Hemingway has been asking reporters who ordinarily cover this beat why. Then I decided since T-Matt has me reading the Washington Post every day, to look at how the paper's health policy reporter was covering Gosnell. I've critiqued many of her stories on Susan G. Komen Foundation. She wrote quite a bit about that. And the Sandra Fluke controversy. She wrote quite a bit about that. And the Todd Aiken controversy. You know where this is going. In fact, a search site for that reporter, who's named Sarah Cliff, and stories Aiken and Fluke and Komen yield more than 80 hits. Guess how many stories she's done on the abortionist mass murder trial? Did you guess 0? You'd be right. So I asked her about it. Here's her response. Hi, Molly. I covered for the Washington Post, not local crime. Hence why I wrote about all the policy issues you mentioned. Yes, she really said that. As Robert Verbruggen dryly responded, makes sense. Similarly, national gun policy people do not cover local crime in places like Aurora or Newtown. So when a private foundation privately decides to stop giving money to the country's largest abortion provider, that is somehow a policy issue deserving of 3 dozen breathless hits. When a Yahoo political candidate says something stupid about rape, that is a policy issue of such import that we got another 3 dozen hits about it from this reporter. It was so important the journalists found it fitting to ask every pro-lifer in their path to discuss it. And when someone says that something mean to a birth control activist, that's good for months of puffy profiles. I know, and I like Sarah Cliff, and this seems harsh to me. There are lots of news out there, and sometimes we don't cover everything our readers would like. But Hemingway, who I also know and like, does have a point. The mainstream media has barely covered a story that could plausibly be named the trial of the century. And that demands explanation. So I'll tell you why I haven't covered it. To start, it makes me ill. I haven't been able to bring myself to read the grand jury inquiry, and frankly, I don't blame her. I'm someone who cringes when I hear a description of a sprained ankle. But I understand why my readers suspect me and other pro-choice mainstream journalists of being selective, of not wanting to cover the story because it showcased the ugliest possibilities of abortion rights. The truth is that most of us tend to be less interested in sick-making stories if the sick-making was done by, quote, our side, end quote. Of course, I'm not saying that I identify with criminal abortionists who kill infants and grievously wound their patients, but I am pro-choice. Again, this is interesting, what's happened since. The Gosnell case came up repeatedly when Pennsylvania's General Assembly was debating a law that put stricter requirements on abortion clinics, holding them to the same standard as outpatient surgery centers. Isn't that what the grand jury just said we should be doing? Which must have wider doors and elevators that can accommodate a stretcher. Critics said the law, supported by Pennsylvania's pro-life governor, Tom Corbett, did little to increase patient safety. Yes, they actually said that it didn't matter whether you could get into the abortion clinic with an ambulance. And resulted in clinics shutting down because they couldn't afford to make the upgrades, which is their real complaint. And notice that it's true. Now that the law is in effect, there are 5 fewer clinics in the state for a total of 17. That is to say, Gosnell wasn't the only one who ran his clinic with total disregard for what to do in an emergency. The issues raised by the Gosnell trial are important. I love this. Poverty, racism, enforcement of medical regulations, government accountability, how something like this could go on in plain view for years. But they're not the issues that generally create partisan outrage or national headlines. They're not the issues that generally create partisan outrage. Well, at least our partisan outrage. Or national headlines. Well, at least not if we control the headlines, they don't. Just totally amazing. More. Oh, that first tells about another Planned Parenthood clinic this time in Delaware that wound up getting closed because they were practicing unsafely. The doctor was not using gloves. They were reusing instruments. Apparently Gosnell may be the worst, but he's certainly not the only. WashingtonPost.com blogs, fact checker. Okay, this is interesting. This is totally rich. When he was in the Illinois Senate, Barack Obama voted to deny basic constitutional protections for babies born alive from an abortion, not once but 4 times. I know. It's by the grace of God that I'm alive today. If only to ask America this question, is this the kind of leadership that will lead us forward, that would discard the weakest among us? This is failed abortion survivor Melissa Oden in a new ad from the Susan B. Anthony list. So they're fact-checking that. And then Obama supports changing the definition of marriage, believes that human life is disposable and expendable at any time in the womb, even beyond the womb. That's former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee. Those are the things they're going to fact check in this particular article. Oden's story. We wondered what Oden meant when she said she was discarded. She explained that, according to her adoptive mother, the medical staff, quote, laid her aside because they didn't think she would live. This sounds less dramatic than being discarded, which could easily give viewers the impression that medical personnel disposed of her body, exactly what the Christian Broadcast Network and Susan B. Anthony list claimed. A birth record posted on Oden's website says nothing about the medical staff laying aside, discarding, or leaving the newborn body for dead. In fact, it shows that the medical staff took steps to preserve her life after checking her APGAR score, which measures the health of newborn babies, and hearing a weak cry. Now, this is a baby who was the subject of an abortion, who is now grown up and protesting the procedure, of course. Perhaps the doctor left out details about leaving the infant for dead. Oden said such information is not likely to ever be recorded. Oden is right. I'm a medical doctor. I know what doctors document, and they're not going to document incriminating stuff against themselves. Especially doctors that are morally bad enough to be involved with abortions. I say that as having watched abortionists and other doctors and seeing a distinct difference in their code of medical ethics. I don't know, maybe not all of them, but I can tell you that there are ones that do. But the fact remains that Oden's medical records do not prove her case about being discarded. The anti-abortion activists also acknowledge that her account of being laid aside after birth came from a secondary source, a nurse from the hospital where she was transferred. So the nurse heard it and then told her mother, and then who told her, or her adoptive mother. Oden said she was unable to put us in touch with anybody who actually witnessed her birth. In light of the only hard evidence available, she earns 2 Pinocchios for claiming that she was discarded at birth. So in other words, the people who heard it secondhand and then told her, she's being told that she's a liar because she believed them. Now remember, this is the standard that the Washington Post is using in their fact check. Born alive legislation. The anti-Obama claims from Huckabee and Oden referred to a series of Illinois bills known as the Born Alive Infant Protection Acts, which would have defined the term born alive infant as any member of the species Homo sapiens expelled or extracted from his mother that exhibits a, quote, a beating heart, pulsations of the umbilical cord, or definite movement of voluntary muscles. And the 2001 and 2002 measures include a controversial line that proved to be a sticking point. It said, a live child born as a result of an abortion shall be fully recognized as a human person and accorded immediate protection under the law. Well, wouldn't you think? Babies born alive? Obama took issue with that part of the bill, saying it would interfere with a woman's right to an abortion. as established from Roe versus Wade's Supreme Court decision. Here's an excerpt from his remarks in the 2004 floor debate, which, by the way, we happen to have recorded. Number one, whenever we define a pre-viable fetus as a person that is protected by the Equal Protection Clause of the other elements of the Constitution, what we're really saying is, in fact, that they are persons that are entitled to the kinds of protections that would be provided to a child, a 9-month-old child that was delivered to term. The determination then is essentially, if it's acceptable by a court, would forbid abortions to take place. I mean, it would essentially bar abortions, because the Equal Protection Clause does not allow somebody to kill a child, and if this is a child, this would be an anti-abortion statute. So the way it's written, it would destroy abortion. Notice that Obama referred to pre-viable fetuses, or those who do not have a reasonable chance of survival outside the mother's body. Obama's primary concern seems to be that this is the Washington Post, and they're reading him charitably, obviously, seems to be that the Born Alive Act would prohibit aborting a fetus still inside the womb. Critics contend that this interpretation is not necessarily true, because some pre-viable fetuses survive after delivery from an unsuccessful abortion. They argue that Obama is essentially opposed to protecting the survivors. Illinois lawmakers voted down identical versions of the Born Alive Infant Protection Act in 2001-2002 before a new iteration of the bill came before the Senate's Health and Human Services Committee, headed by Obama. This new legislation removed the controversial line about recognizing live-born children as humans, so they took that out, and giving them immediate protection under the law. It also addressed Obama's concern about pre-viable fetuses, adding a neutrality clause that said the measure would not affect the legal status of fetuses prior to delivery. So in other words, this is not talking about abortion. Nevertheless, Obama voted against the new bill, which happened to be an almost identical exact replica, almost to the word, of a federal Born Alive Infant Protection Act that passed in 2002 without opposition in either political party. The vote in the House was voice vote, and the vote in the Senate was unanimous consent. But unanimous consent means anybody that objected, it's no longer unanimous consent. Now, Obama swore during the 2008 election that he would have supported the federal Born Alive Infants Protection Act, promoting the National Right to Life Committee to issue a scathing white paper that pointed out how he had contradicted himself by voting against the Illinois measure while backing the older federal version in retrospect during his presidential campaign. Obama denied any contradiction during an interview that year with the Christian Broadcasting Network, accusing the anti-abortion committee of lying about the circumstances of his vote. Here's what he said. This is Obama commenting on him, what he had done. I hate to say that people are lying, but here's a situation where folks are lying. I've said repeatedly that I would have been fully in support of the federal bill that everybody supported, which was to say that you should provide assistance to any infant that was born, even if it was as a consequence of an induced abortion. That was not the bill that was presented at the state level. What that bill also was doing was trying to undermine Roe versus Wade. From what we can tell, Obama misrepresented the facts during this interview. The 2003 bill addressed his concerns about undermining Roe versus Wade, and it matched the federal legislation that he supported virtually word for word. PolitiFact determined that the claim about a neutrality clause in the federal legislation was true. FactCheck.org says Obama's claim about the committee's lying is wrong. For what it's worth, the fact checker in 2008 appears to have overlooked the neutrality clause while awarding 2 Pinocchios in a column that examined a separate claim for then GOP vice presidential candidate Sarah Palin. In other words, she was lying about him. However, that oversight wouldn't have affected Palin's rating because her claim was different, closer to the claim from Huckabee. That is to say, he really didn't care about babies born alive afterwards. The evidence suggests we could have awarded 4 Pinocchios to the former Illinois senator for his comments to the Christian Broadcasting Network. But that interview is several years old now, and it's not the focus of this particular column. He lied, he deserves 4 Pinocchios, but we're not going to give it to him because the statute of limitations has expired, I think. The president's campaign did not respond to requests for comment on the matter of whether Obama's 2008 comments on the Christian Broadcasting Network contradicted his 2003 vote against the Illinois Born Alive Infants Protection Bill. Well, no, yeah, I suppose they wouldn't. Now, Odin said that Obama, quote, voted to deny basic constitutional protections for babies born alive from abortion. This is true in the sense that the Illinois ban would have guaranteed certain protections for these infants. But Odin's claim lacks context. Obama's objections to the bill suggest that he wasn't so much bent on denying rights to newborns as wanting to block any legislation that could erode the premise of the Roe versus Wade decision. Odin earns 1 Pinocchio for his slanted take on the president's position. Now, think about this. She's getting called a liar for this. A minor liar, but a liar. Because she didn't take Obama at his word. He deserves 4 Pinocchios. He can't be taken at his word. And yet they're still calling her a liar for not doing that. And the same way about Huckabee. He gets 3 Pinocchios. Can anybody say media bias? And he deserved 4, but he didn't get the pictures. And Planned Parenthood has lobbied for post-birth control. And I won't read you the whole thing, but we'll just come down to the testimony itself. Planned Parenthood comments came at a recent Florida legislative hearing from Elisa Lapointe Snow, who is opposing a proposal that would require a doctor to provide care to an infant on whom an abortion failed to kill. Lawmakers were stunned, asking the same question over and over. So it's really hard for me to even ask you this question because I'm almost in disbelief, said Representative Jim Boyd. If a baby is born on a table as a result of a botched abortion, what would Planned Parenthood want to have happen to that child struggling for life? Quote, we believe that any decision that's made should be left up to the woman, her family, and the physician. I suppose that includes Dr. Gosnell? And they went over it and over it and over it again, and when one lawmaker suggested at that point the patient also would include the newborn, Snow responded, that's a very good question. I would be glad to have some more conversation with you about this. The Weekly Standard reported that Snow diverted the conversation when another lawmaker specifically asked, what objection could you possibly have to obligate a doctor to transport a child born alive to a hospital where it seems to me they would be most likely to be able to survive? And she responded that in some rural situations the hospital is 45 minutes or an hour away, and said logistical issues were concerning. As if logistical issues ever stood in the way of having somebody taken to a hospital who had had an automobile accident, or who had suddenly developed an allergic reaction at a clinic. And if you're curious, if you go to the website which was detailed above, you can actually listen to her giving these. And then it goes on to detail that this is very similar to what Obama had to say. And since we've already gone over most of that, let me just go to the bill very quickly. I think that as this emerged during debate and during committee, the only plausible rationale to my mind for this legislation would be if you had a suspicion that a doctor, the attending physician, who has made an assessment that this is a non-viable fetus, and that, let's say for the purposes of the mother's health, is being that labor is being induced, and that the physician A, is going to make the wrong assessment, and B, if the physician discovered after labor had been induced that in fact he made an error or she made an error, and in fact the physician of his own or her own accord, and there's a little bit more in the at this point in the tape, which is didn't make it into the transcript, would not try to exercise the sort of medical measures and practices that would be involved in saving the child. Now, if you think there are possibilities that doctors would not do that, then maybe this bill makes sense. Possibilities that doctor might not do that? Can we say Kermit Gosnell? Yeah. But, and I suspect, and my impression is that the medical society suspects as well that doctors feel they would be under that obligation, that they would already be making these determinations, well, all except that the less ethical of them. And that essentially adding an additional doctor who then has to be called in an emergency situation to come in and make these assessments is really designed simply to burden the original decision of the woman and the physician to induce labor and perform an abortion. No, it's designed to save the kid. Now, if that's the case, and I know that some of us feel very strongly one way or another on that issue, that's fine, but I think it is important to understand that this issue ultimately is about abortion and not live births. Because if these children are being born alive, I at least have confidence that a doctor who is in that room is going to make sure they're looked after. Well, Gosnell looked after him real good. And like I say, there's actually an audio where you can hear him make those comments. Now, I think, in fact, Obama is right. The legislation, if implemented, would destroy at least late-term abortion. And here's how. A 29-week-old baby survives, but has cerebral palsy. The mother and the doctor are both happy with that. Well, as happy as they can be. Not really, because she didn't want him in the first place. But at 18 years old, this baby now has the right, since it's reached the age of maturity, to sue the abortion clinic provider and the clinic for everything they have. And in front of a reasonable jury, probably would get it. Why didn't you know that it was 29 weeks instead of the 21 weeks you put in the chart? The late abortion industry is, in fact, dependent on nobody surviving. That's why benign neglect in the case of Chicago and snipping in the case of, by the way, there was testimony in front of Barack Obama on this very issue about babies that were being left to die, literally. So the answer was yes, there were things like that happening. He just didn't want to hear about it. That's why an abortionist cannot be required to have a consultation if the baby is born alive from their perspective. Because if he's required to have a consultation, then the baby might survive. The baby could sue the clinic and him for everything they had. And nobody would do late-term abortions. Well, that wouldn't be such a bad thing. Late-term abortion has nothing to do with a woman's wanting to control her own body. If she wants to, she can have the kid, prematurely give it up for adoption, and then she has her body back. It has everything to do with wanting the baby dead. That's the debate that the media don't want to happen, and why the media black out. With that, comments, questions?
I wish I had a couple of hours to give my opinion, but I don't have that time. You didn't say anything about the Adventist media. The Loma Linda University did a study about abuse of children, child abuse. They did a study. So I wrote an article and asked the question, will Loma Linda someday do a study about the utmost form of child abuse and send it to Advindicate. Advindicate is an organization that is growing by leaps and bounds. They oppose evolution. They oppose abortion. They oppose what last year did when they named one building in honor of the greatest abortionist who was an Adventist originally and then left the church, became a millionaire. They published this, and there's been quite a bit of discussion, but not enough. 264 comments, and then they closed the ability to...
After a while, the comments start to become repetitive, I think.
Now, I don't know if you know that when Reagan was a president, the Born Alive law was instituted, and pro-lifers were excited. But it was contested, and a judge declared that the law was unconstitutional because it infringed on the woman's right to have an abortion. Now,
is the Born Alive law fairly similar to the one that was finally enacted?
Yeah.
Now, here's the thing that's interesting about that. What that judge was doing was basically siding with Obama and Planned Parenthood. And baby is not a baby until the mother and the doctor decide that it is. And if the doctor decides that, well, this one shouldn't survive, then, you know. I think one of the things that's happening with Gosnell is that edifice is starting to crack. And that's, of course, precisely why the mainstream media didn't want it there, is because once you see where this goes, you realize that there's a huge problem.
Well, that is true, and you probably know that Peter Singer, a renowned Princeton University scholar, he is saying that we should give personhood rights to animals, but should give the right to parents to kill their children up until 1 month after birth, because they may not be really happy with what they got.
All I've got to say is I'm glad that he made it 1 month instead of 16 years, or there might be a lot of people taking him up on that.
Now, let me say just one additional comment.
The guy way in the back. Yes.
Would you say something about the Adventist media silence on this?
Well,
because we are very, how do you say, we talk about everything. And if anybody touches the investigative judgment, we really get unhappy. But something like this happens, and the Adventist media is silent. I am tired of sending stuff to Adventist publication. They won't publish anything.
Well,
except Advindicate and except One Time Adventist Today.
Well,
why is this silent? This is the remnant God of the Church of God. We are supposed to give the last message to the world, and we are silent about the worst crimes committed in the name of freedom.
I will point out to you that right now we took over an hour to review the facts. That's right. For those of you who have not been watching your clocks, that's over an hour. And I know some of you have to go elsewhere, but it sounds like it's a gripping subject, so we'll keep going for a little bit. But that's part of my intention here, is to partly correct that. I think it's way overdue. And I think I think one of the things that I want to point out really strongly is that once the baby can survive on the outside, there is absolutely no excuse for the mother to claim that she wants control over her own body. She can have it any time she wants. Just deliver the baby, give it to somebody who will take care of it, and she can have her body back. It's about killing the baby at that point. Pure and simple. And in fact, once you establish that, you begin to wonder whether maybe if it's first trimester, it's about killing the baby and not about wanting control over your own body. That this whole idea of controlling your own body is in fact a fiction. Now don't get me wrong, I think there are tough cases. Things like particularly rape, probably more than anything else. Babies that are severely deformed, and I'm not talking about Down syndrome here, because Down syndrome, frankly, are some of the nicest people you'll ever meet. I'm talking about babies that don't have any brain at all, and encephalics. Those are tough cases. But the truth of the matter is the tough cases are being written to support what is basically baby killing.
I have 3 points. One, under whose definition is a crime? Because we know that the government is in charge of crimes. The other one is you can take your body back. So we hold it for a period of 9 months. Then you can have it back. And the other one is my question to you is, are you against the law, the Roe versus Wade?
I think that Roe versus Wade was very poorly thought out. I understand where it came from. It was an effort to try to make sense over all kinds of regulations and lack of regulations and that different people had. And I think that the people who enacted it were well-intentioned. I think they were wrong. I think they were fundamentally wrong in the same kind of way as Dred Scott was fundamentally wrong.
What about the other two? The crime and the holding the body of the woman.
Well, the truth of the matter is that if Gosnell gets convicted, it will be very clear to everybody that, in fact, once the baby is out of the womb, it's a separate person and it deserves full protection. And I think that at that point, what's her name's Kirsten Powers' complaint will be an obvious and valid one. What makes 6 inches of movement make something legal versus not legal? I think late-term abortion will not survive this blow. I think the only thing that anybody can possibly argue for really morally is early abortion. I have severe reservations about that myself. Can you pass the mic over?
In answer to Nick's question, every institution wants to protect itself, thus control the news. I was a witness to an incident that was ugly, and the church reported it as if it were a flower garden. So I wrote the editor asking, why you can't tell the truth about what happened? And the answer was interesting. It was, God's people have enough trouble in their lives without reading about trouble in the church paper. So you see, with the best of motives, we fail to tell the truth.
I think one of the things that will happen out of this is that a question that had been put way in the back burner is going to come forward, and I think the resolution is going to be much more to the liking of people who are conservative in this regard. And I think that, in fact, that is precisely what the mainstream media feared, because they are, in fact, liberal, as some of them have said openly. And that's why the blackout, until they were shamed by Kirsten Powers. And all of the little excuses that they were given about how this is a local matter, we all know better. Those deserve at least 3 Pinocchios. Whether they'll get them from the Washington Post is another matter. Yes.
These recent bombings, too, talking about the media and things. I mean, it's talking about, of course, all the normal things you'd expect. However, it's not taken, the media was not covering all the, perhaps, tens of thousands at least, of little kids that we've been blowing up in Iraq and blowing their legs off. That's like, no, we don't want to look at that. We don't want to, face the fact that maybe if that happened to us, we'd want to go over there and blow some of their kids up because, the media is not covering it and Americans are ignoring it. And it's an illegal war in the first place, and they're ignoring that too. It's against the Constitution. So there's no government of the people. That's the problem right now. And there doesn't seem to be any awareness either, and then the media is just doing their thing that they always do.
Well, the media were quite happy to be against the war until a new commander-in-chief took over. So.
Well, supposedly there's only 5 or 6 people that control the whole media anyway. So maybe that's why.
Yes.
Paul, this is a question to you. I have in mind, actually not a question. Sister White said, ask the questioners if their question has been answered, because I feel that you didn't answer my 2 other questions of the holding the body of the woman for 9 months and under which definition is considered a crime.
What I have been doing is not trying to go into the controversy of abortion in particular. I have given some hints as to which way I would go, and I think that I would want to explain not only what my position is, but what the rationale behind it is, before I would want to fully answer that question. And maybe we should take another time as and I can give you what I think, and then you guys can critique it or make your own proposals as to what is appropriate. But if a woman has already held the baby for 6 months, then we're not talking about holding her hostage for 9 months. You can have the baby out now if you want. They don't have to be hostage for more than about a day or so, and they'd have to do that anyway if they had an abortion. So once we've passed that point, we're no longer talking about a woman who has to carry a baby. We're talking about a woman who could get rid of it anytime she wanted to. It's just a question of whether the baby comes out alive or dead.
Can I make a comment? I have in mind that some women, the reason for abortion is to not, in certain sense, destroy their future lives, because they got pregnant because they went drunk that night and they're gonna mess their lives. So, and some they don't want to have the parenthood right away. And if we force them, I think that's the Roe versus Wade.
Well, like I say, that takes a lot more justification than what we have right now and what I can give. I have just given you the extreme, and I've said basically you get beyond this. And we're not talking about abortion anymore. We're talking about after-birth abortion. We're talking about infanticide. We're talking about the thing that made the Lord really unhappy with the Canaanites, vowing to drive them out with hornets if necessary. Rome and Carthage had a conflict. Rome was not exactly a nice place either. But Carthage sacrificed little infants. And when you realize that, you start realizing why. There are people that would say, Carthago delende est. Carthage must be destroyed. We are approaching that in parts of our own culture. Yes.
Okay, regarding Eduardo's observation and question, I want to remind him and us that the baby is not part of the woman's body, and the woman who claims it's my body, I should have the right to do what I want to with my body, is in error. Because the Bible says our body belongs to God. And I was reading the story of a woman. She was going to have an abortion, and she heard a voice saying, "Don't do it. I have a plan for that baby." And I forgot. Oh yeah. The end was the baby was born. He became a renowned painter. And God wanted that baby to grow up and to become a painter. Now, there's something else I want to add. The media bombing. 3 people died, and the news media are non-stop. Channel 45, Channel 46, and some other channels have been commenting on this, on what happened to 3 people, non-stop. And we don't know when it's going to stop. It's going to continue. But this man killed 7 human beings.
And killed hundreds more that we just can't document.
Exactly. And the media has no interest in talking about that. Now, there's one thing, this is something...
Actually, you will see the media get very quiet right now, and I'll tell you why. Because the bombers were Chechen and they were Islamic. And you will suddenly see that story start to fade.
Yeah.
Now, as long as it could have been blamed on the Tea Party, because after all, it was on the anniversary of Lexington and Concord, then the media were quite interested. But they'll lose interest now. Don't worry about it.
Now, there's something else I want to add, which I said on other occasions, but people tend to not to pay attention. You sent an email to, I don't know what's your list, but it probably has close to 100 names,
A little
right?
over 100.
Okay,
Yeah.
over 100. How many do we have today? I sent a message to Eduardo, my friend, Eduardo, to make sure he would be here. And if everybody did the same thing, we should have 200 people here. Adventists are not interested in this issue.
Well, to be fair, it will now be out on the internet so that you can send it to everybody. I have been amazed, the one that I did on dinosaur carbon-14 is starting to be sent out by the group that did it, looked at it, and they liked what they saw, and they're telling their friends, oh, look at this. At least they told one friend who has emailed me since. So for what it's worth, we may not have the biggest voice, but I think that doesn't excuse us from using our voice when we can.
Yeah. You're going to have a few Adventists doing that. Most Adventists will not do it. They have no interest. And this is my final comment. Some of us do not know that back in 1970, the Adventist Church looked aside and allowed our hospital in Hawaii to provide abortions on demand, elective abortions, which is a violation of our own guidelines and a violation of the law of God. This was documented in Adventist media, 5 Adventist hospitals, at least 5 Adventist hospitals did the same for many years. And the church is silent on this. I have written to the General Conference, I have written to the President, I have talked to the President, to Ted Wilson. I asked him for help before publishing my book, and he said, sure. He was willing to help. Well, I'm still waiting. It's almost 2 years. No help. There's no interest. There's no interest in this topic.
Maybe when people see where it's going, they'll realize what a farce the whole show is. We will see.
To that phrase, where it's going, I think that overturning Roe versus Wade is going to unite the state, church and state, and take away our liberties. That's my thinking.
Well, I would partially defer. And even more than deferring there, I think the one thing that we need to take into account is whether we believe in liberty or not is a whole different question than whether we should, as a church, be supporting this kind of thing. And it is a rational position to take that we're not going to make it the law of the land, but we are going to make it the law of the Adventist Church. That is a rational position. And I think that Nick is perfectly right to say that our behavior among ourselves is as difficult to defend as the behavior of the rest of the world. We're supposed to know better. Well, next week, don't come here. 2 weeks from now, there's some other news that's that's coming up, that has just come out, that I may try to pursue. Eventually, I will probably try to get back to the abortion controversy and try to lay out some kind of rationale for where I would draw the lines.